Chris Farfoi.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, for allowing me another opportunity to speak to the Radio New Zealand Amendment Bill. And I'd like to pick up where my colleague Grant Robertson left off, and that is around the democratic function of good journalism. And I'll come to the Charter, which is within the bill, to be able to extrapolate those points a little bit later on in my contribution. I'd also like to point out that while technology is changing the way that information is disseminating, we talk about different platforms, we talk about convergence, online streaming, all these different ways of getting the information which we used to get through our radios, something has to remain constant for in order for us to keep listening. And that's some pretty important principles which are at the very heart of public broadcasting. And that is around quality, independence, integrity and reach and other qualities like that, which, regardless of the medium which you are receiving the information, have to stay true. And that is what we are worried about on this side of the House when we are talking about freezing of funding. But I'd like to put those in the context of journalism and also what was within this bill around the Charter. Because Clause 8 goes into some detail, Mr Chair, and what is expected of Radio New Zealand around the Charter. 8.1 says Radio New Zealand must be an independent public service broadcaster and the purpose is to serve the public interest. 8.4 says the public radio company provides reliable, independent and freely accessible news information. 5A and B say that these services must be predominantly and distinctively of New Zealand nature. They must inform and enlighten the people of New Zealand. And G and I of Clause 5 say that this content should provide awareness of the world and of New Zealand's place in it and provide comprehensive, independent, accurate, impartial and balanced regional, national and international news and current affairs. So Radio New Zealand, because it is legislated to do this, plays a very, very important function in the fourth estate. And I think over the last year there have been some worrying signs about the nature of journalism and the fourth estate. We've seen the demise of a current affairs program 3D at TV3. We've seen the demise of Campbell Live at TV3. We've also seen the demise on both major channels around that 7 p.m. slot. What used to be Close Up and Homes back in the day has now become 7 sharp. And I'll let people make up their own minds on that. But there is an important function within this legislation that says Radio New Zealand has to hold some pretty important principles of journalism up higher than other broadcasters or news media companies. And I'd actually like to praise Radio New Zealand for its efforts to be able to do that under the current freeze in budget that they've had at the moment. They've had challenges around being able to have to deliver on different kinds of platforms, but I think they've done a pretty good job of keeping their integrity, keeping them balanced, keeping impartial, all those qualities that the Charter within this bill requires of Radio New Zealand under extremely different circumstances. But I think it also means there is a greater importance on Radio New Zealand around journalism. And also, another debate that might need to start in New Zealand, that there should be funding for other news media organisations to make sure that these kinds of principles around journalism are upheld in other areas too. And that's another debate around New Zealand On Air. But I would like to make sure that these principles around the integrity of journalism are upheld as best as they can by Radio New Zealand, and that can only be done if a government takes that entity seriously. And I think with this bill languishing on the order paper for well over 7 or 8 years, Mr Chair, the funding freeze that numerous speakers have spoken to on this side of the House, and the fact that in other areas of public broadcasting that this government has shown no taste at all for wanting to continue anything that holds people like us to account is not good for our democracy. And I want to, as a former journalist, make sure that everyone in this House is held to account properly. And I think as a bastion of all those principles as laid out in this legislation, Radio New Zealand is legislated to do that properly. But if we're going to put this in legislation, let's back up these words in this legislation with some commitment from the government that it's going to help Radio New Zealand achieve that. Because if we don't, Mr Chair, then all these words that are in this legislation, Mr Chair, then all the words that are in this legislation are merely words. And the ability of Radio New Zealand, a very important broadcasting entity, will not be that it can deliver on what we ask it to do. So I praise it because I think it's doing a good job within its constraints. We are again asking it to have a very important function in our democracy, to hold people like us in this House to account. But if we don't give it the means to do that, then I think that is not a good sign for democracy in this country.